Okay, somehow I accidentally hit stop on the video. So this is back to the acceleration enrichment. I kind of basically was telling you that you kind of want to make this curve gradual. You don't want to have any of these things way up like this or down like this. Kind of just keep it a gradual motion all the way up and down. So over here, this icon is the temperature enrichment. This adds fuel as the car is warm or hotter. It just kind of depends on what you want to do. One of the moderators over at Holley on the forum, he was talking about not putting this number any higher than 130, so I kind of went with that. You can see it's 130 versus 0, 20 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's richening up the car a lot at a colder temp. And then as the car warms up, you can see I'm slowly pulling out fuel. I believe in the base map it stops here at 180 and just doesn't take or add fuel anymore. You kind of got to play around with this and see what your car likes. This air-fuel ratio offset. Now, what this does, and this means negative 0.6, what this is actually doing is richening the air-fuel ratio by 0.6. And it's doing it again once at a colder temp because you want to have some more fuel when the car is warming up. And then as it gets to about 140 degrees, you can see I have almost no extra fuel getting added. And then at 160 on, it's just going off my base idle air-fuel ratio. So over here, I don't mess around with this air temp enrichment, so I wouldn't worry about it. Startup enrichment. This is adding extra fuel while you're cranking. This is another thing you got to kind of maybe play around with if your car is having a hard time starting at various temps. I believe the comes default at 150%. You can play with this fuel prime percentage. It talks about it in the instructions. I put mine at 130 and I lowered the fuel prime multiplier by 1 from 5 to 4. So it's just an experimentation. After start enrichment icon. This is the amount of extra fuel that's getting added right after the car starts. It kind of must maybe coincide a little bit with the temperature enrichment, and this must just be the amount of extra fuel that's being added at the car starts from stop. Maybe it's even after it's sitting for 15 minutes or it's been sitting for an hour or two. Once again, I've played around with this graph and added extra fuel and kind of made this slope a little taller and then gradually kind of leaned it out right here about 160. I got kind of a car that seems to be kind of cold-blooded. Fuel control, I don't really worry about this. You can do some more reading if you want to use this function or not. So if you click these little icons up here, they'll add these extra tables and then you can pick different things. If you don't want it around, you can just click the red arrow here and get rid of the fuel one. And what these sensors do is you can kind of make your own custom gauge panel. And I haven't really bothered playing around with that. I just use the stock one. Right here, this is the system parameters. You can see that maybe when you're using the little handheld device, you put in some of these parameters. But in here is where you make those changes. I got 8 cylinders, engine displacement. I got a 30 over 360, and I'm running the Holley dual sync, so I put it at 50 degrees before top dead center, and I've raised the inductive delay I think from 20 to 100, and it seems to be right on when I have it with a timing light and cranking up the RPM to kind of make sure to verify the timing's not off. This bar, I haven't messed around with the EFI parameters. I leave that alone. This is where you can change all the I/O wiring if you have electric fans or AC, and I don't have any of that alternative stuff. Here's where you turn on or off the closed loop parameters, and this is basically, do you want the computer to start learning at a certain temp, which you do. So you need to have this thing checked, enable closed loop. And then I have enabled the minimum coolant temp for closed loop, so it doesn't start learning till it gets to 160. I suppose you could change it to 140 or 120, but 160 kind of seems to be what the average is on what I see other people using, so I just went with that. Maybe then after you got the fuel map learned, then you don't want it learning anymore. you can just disable closed loop. And then I think in here you have to turn this base fuel learn on or off. So just make sure that those are checked before you're driving around. So in here, this is the idle speed. You can see I have the idle speed. I kind of adjusted it up about 1200 when the car's cold, and then I have it dropping down to about 900 as my idle speed. You can play around with that. Once again, you just adjust the arrows around, it's no big deal, and then see what your car likes. IAC settings. Now this is kind of one of these things that I've played around with a little bit to kind of maybe figure out what's, you know, optimum for the car. You can see there's IAC control. I have the sniper controlling the idle air controller. There's a slow, medium, or fast setting under here, and I've heard about people using the slow, and I think it's the ramp down on how fast the thing goes up or down. But I just have the sniper adjusting it. You know, you can play around with the IAC hold position. This is how far the IAC is held open above a certain RPM. So you can watch it in a gauge as you're accelerating up, and this thing will stay open at 40%. Then when you deaccelerate, it'll go back down from 40 to that 2 to 10% that you set it in the initial settings per the Holley instructions back at idle. And this is how fast the decay happens. So how fast the IAC is dropping down from the 40% down to your 2 or 10%, wherever you got it set. And these are a couple other settings you can play around with. You know, RPM above idle to start ramp. So that's the RPM above my idle. So I guess my idle is 900 and this is 15, so it's 2400. So that's when it starts ramping down. And then RPM above idle to re-enable the idle control. So at about 950, so only 50 RPM above my idle setting, is when the computer is going to take back over and go, all right, I know I need to move the IAC around to maintain that steady idle RPM that I required. And then I haven't played around with the startup IAC position at all. Right here under IAC parked, this is what the IAC will slowly, you can see it's opened a lot more at colder temps, so it's allowing more air in. And it's combining, I usually combine that with the extra rich fuel at idle to kind of give the car what it wants as it slowly warms up. And I kind of got this dropped off at about 160. I have it staying at this 50 setting, and this is basically whatever you set it at in the base idle, that 2 to 10%. So you can play around with this and see what you like or don't like, what your engine likes. It's just kind of a thing where I can't make a recommendation. You got to kind of just play around with it. But I wouldn't get crazy on any real steep settings. I just make small gradual settings. So up here is the spark table. Now, once again, I don't really use the graph. Some people probably do. So it's just a map versus RPM on the graph. And this is roughly where it's idling at. I got it at about, what, 25.2 degrees. And then I have it slowly ramping up, 34, 44 at 1600, and then it would be 55 at 18, so if I was cruising. But then when I slam it wide open throttle, you see I got 43 degrees. Like I said, I kind of kept increasing ignition timing, and this motor wasn't bucking at all, and I don't hear any rattling. So, you know, I got basically a low compression motor that likes a lot of timing, and it seems to respond to it quite well. So I don't really worry about it too much. But in here is where you'll be making all your timing changes. And there's the graph. Here's the cranking parameters. I leave these stock. They come at 15 degrees. And then to crank to run RPMs 400. Here's the rev limiter. I got mine at 5700 since I don't really know how well the valve train, everything's set up. I may adjust that up to $6 grand, but you know, I'm not really bouncing off the rev limiter much. In here's a launch retard, which I don't use, but you could take timing out at launch and then bring it back in here. Timing versus coolant temp, as you can see, I leave it stock at 0, or timing versus air temp. So hotter or cooler out, you could take timing in or out rather than you know, manually coming in here and adjusting. You could set up the map, so if you know at different times of the day when you know it's going to be hotter or colder, you could have the timing already preset to take more or add more. So here's the data logger chart. I haven't really used this much yet. You can go in there and you can run it and then hit run and it'll record a pass, and there'll be all kinds of things in there. It talks about it in the manual on what you can look for in there. This is the gauge panel. This is pretty cool that I'll use when the car's running, and it's got all the different specs and what it's reading. And you got these different views down here. I got ignition timing, here's your target air fuel ratio, here's what it actually is doing. And so you can kind of verify what the motor's doing, look at everything here all at once. So this is a pretty cool icon. Okay, so what I'm going to do here now is power on the car, and I got just the ignition turned on. And what I'm going to do is hit this USB link. And what this does is this now makes the software and my computer talking at the same time. You can see I got now data right from the computer on what it's reading. And I can go up here and go to these. You can see they're all stuck there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the car. So you can see what everything's doing here. You know, it's adding fuel, that CL comp. If that had been a minus, that would have been, it's taking away fuel. You can see I got the air fuel ratio there. It's jumping from about 13 to 14. And there's my RPM, and there's my coolant temp. Here's the IAC position. Here's the air temp coming in. Here's my manifold pressure. Now, for those who are not used to looking at this, 100 means 0. So that would basically be at wide open throttle and there's no more pressure anymore. I have a little mechanical gauge you can see here.